A white pastor in Texas recently drew criticism for a tweet in which he compared Vice President Kamala Harris to the biblical queen Jezebel. He was immediately criticized for being a racist, and a black pastor in his denomination broke fellowship with him and called for him to be censured in some way or for him to repent and repudiate his tweet. The white pastor has since doubled down and said, no, I meant what I said. So, is it racist to compare a black woman to Jezebel? Let's find out. I'm David Lang, and this is Bible to Life, where we bring the Bible to life so that it can better impact your life. Now, we recently did a series of videos on the biblical queen Jezebel and her husband Ahab. And at first we looked at how those two wicked rulers led the nation of Israel astray into idolatry and then conspired to murder an innocent man and take his land. For that crime, they were condemned by the prophet Elijah, and God promised that he would bring judgment on them. And then in a couple of follow-up videos, we looked at God's judgment against Ahab and then his judgment against Jezebel. And in that third video, we really looked at Jezebel's character and tried to understand what were her motivations for acting the way that she did. So having done those videos, it's interesting to me to see Jezebel now at the center of this controversy about a supposedly racist tweet. So let's look at the tweet in question and let's consider whether it really is racist. The pastor at the center of this controversy is a Southern Baptist pastor in Texas named Tom Buck, and he tweeted this: I can't imagine any truly God-fearing Israelite who would have wanted their daughters to view Jezebel as an inspirational role model because she was a woman in power. Now, Pastor Buck doesn't even name Kamala Harris in this tweet, but it's pretty clear that he's talking about her and the amount of acclaim that she has received as the first black woman vice president in the United States. The response to Pastor Buck's tweet was that he had said something racist. And so he tried to clarify what he was getting at with a follow-up tweet. For those torn up over my tweet, I stand by it 100%. My problem is her godless character. She not only is the most radical pro-abortion VP ever, but also most radical LGBT advocate. She performed one of the first lesbian marriages. Pray for her, but don't praise her. So Pastor Buck tried to make it clear that, look, I'm not saying that she shouldn't be celebrated because she's a black woman. I'm saying she shouldn't be celebrated because she has ungodly policies and questionable character. That follow-up tweet really didn't assuage those who were criticizing Pastor Buck. They continued to press the notion that he had said something racist. For example, an article by Mark Wingfield of Baptist News Global summarized the issue like this: calling a black woman Jezebel is a racist trope documented by the Jim Crow Museum of Racist Memorabilia at Ferris State University. It has roots in slavery and the perceived sexual promiscuity of black women compared to white women. Now, Mr. Wingfield gave a link to this Jim Crow Museum of Racist Memorabilia to support his point that this is a racist trope. So I followed that link to an article by Dr. David Pilgrim of Ferris State University. And he wrote, the portrayal of black women as lascivious by nature is an enduring stereotype. Historically, white women as a category were portrayed as models of self-respect, self-control, and modesty, even sexual purity. But black women were often portrayed as innately promiscuous, even predatory. This depiction of black women is signified by the name Jezebel. All right, so Dr. Pilgrim demonstrates that black women in the antebellum South and beyond have been stereotyped as sexually promiscuous, even predatory. And in this article, the rest of this article, he he demonstrates that clearly, that there have been these stereotypes that have been promulgated by antebellum Southerners, by Hollywood in black exploitation films, and of course the racism and exploitation of blacks in pornographic films of today is well documented. So it's an ongoing problem. And Dr. Pilgrim says this depiction of black women is signified by the name Jezebel. So he essentially says this Jezebel stereotype represents a sexually promiscuous stereotype of black women. But the interesting thing about the article was I never found anywhere that there was some quotation in which someone stereotyping black women as sexually promiscuous used the term Jezebel. So I began looking at Dr. Pilgrim's sources in the end of the article, and that led me to a book by a black historian named Deborah Gray White, who wrote a book back in the 70s, I believe, called Aren't I a Woman? And in the first chapter of her book, she talks about what she calls the Jezebel stereotype. And she says this: one of the most prevalent images of black women in antebellum America was of a person governed almost entirely by her libido, a Jezebel character. She did not lead men and children to God. Piety was foreign to her. She saw no advantage in prudery. Indeed, domesticity paled in importance before matters of the flesh. So she's talking about this stereotype as well, and she also documents examples of this exploitative stereotype of black women. But the impression that I get from Dr. White's argument is that she's the one applying the term Jezebel to this stereotype. So, again, to read again, one of the most prevalent images of black women in antebellum America was of a person governed almost entirely by her libido, a Jezebel character. Well, that seems to be Dr. White's assertion, that this is a Jezebel character. And then she expands on that character. She did not lead men and children to God. Well, that's certainly consistent with Jezebel. Piety was foreign to her. She saw no advantage in prudery. Indeed, domesticity paled in importance before matters of the flesh. So she says the idea that a profligate woman, a woman consumed with sexual desire, a nymphomaniac, is a Jezebel stereotype, and this Jezebel stereotype was applied to black women. But again, she gives no quotation in which, for example, a slave owner who is trying to market black women slaves to lustful men calls them a Jezebel and says, "Oh, I've got a real Jezebel here. You'll want to buy this one." There's nothing like that. It seems pretty clear from what I've read of Dr. White's argument that she's the one coming up with this Jezebel label, but that it's not a label that was used by racists necessarily. Now, is Jezebel an appropriate label for a profligate woman, a woman who's essentially a nymphomaniac? Well, let's look briefly at the biblical passages, a couple of biblical passages that relate to Jezebel's character. One is 2 Kings 9:22. And when Joram saw Jehu, he said, "Is it peace, Jehu?" Now, Jehu is the man who is coming to overthrow Joram, the king of Israel, the son of Jezebel. And so he asks Jehu, Joram asks Jehu, "Are you coming in peace?" And Jehu answers, "What peace can there be so long as the whorings," in Greek that's porneia, "and the sorceries of your mother Jezebel are so many?" So Jehu essentially says, no, there can be no peace because of the whorings, the sexual immorality of your mother Jezebel. Now, as we talked about in the third video in our Jezebel series, This reference to Jezebel's porneia, her whorings, her sexual immorality, may refer to actual physical sexual immorality, but it may also be a metaphorical reference to the fact that she has led Israel to be unfaithful to Israel's God. And so it's not necessarily that she was literally engaged in sexual immorality, but she was leading the people into spiritual immorality, spiritual unfaithfulness to God. Now, we'll see Jezebel's character also alluded to in the New Testament. In the book of Revelation, when Jesus comes to John and says, "Write these letters to the 7 churches in Asia Minor," he writes to the church in Thyatira, "But I have this against you, that you tolerate that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess and is teaching and seducing my servants to practice sexual immorality," in Greek porneia, "and to eat food sacrificed to idols." So in this passage, Jesus actually compares some woman who is a false teacher in Asia Minor to Jezebel, and he condemns the church for tolerating this person who is teaching Christians to practice sexual immorality and to engage in idolatry. And again, the question is this actual physical sexual immorality, or is this a spiritual immorality, spiritual unfaithfulness to God? And the argument can be made either way. If we look at how this notion of Jezebel's character is applied later on in Christian tradition, let's look at the church father Ecumenius. In the 6th century AD, he wrote a commentary on Revelation, and he talks about this passage in which Jesus condemns this person that he calls Jezebel because she has Jezebel's character. And he writes this: "For in the person of Jezebel, the wife of Ahab, he sees a paradigm for the wickedness of that woman who lived at that time. And she, he says, who calls herself a prophetess, teaches and deceives many to commit fornication and to eat food sacrificed to idols." He refers either to physical fornication or to idolatry. So this early church father recognized that the reference to porneia with respect to this prophetess who is being described as like Jezebel, it may refer to physical fornication, or it may refer to spiritual fornication, to turning away from God and turning to other gods. So Christian tradition has often used the idea of Jezebel to represent strong, imperious, rebellious women. That's the primary sense of what it means to be a Jezebel. And a woman who leads people astray, that's kind of the secondary sense of what it means to be a Jezebel. And the idea of sexual immorality is there, but it's not the central aspect to Jezebel's character. It is, she's a wicked woman who deceives and leads people astray. Part of that may be in leading them into sexual fornication or spiritual fornication, idolatry. But that's sort of it's connected to Jezebel, but it's not her primary characteristic. And so when Dr. White takes the name Jezebel and applies that to oversexed images of black women, she's taking sort of a third of what it means to be a Jezebel. She could have chosen any number of other characters to describe a loose woman. Jezebel implies a woman who's in power and who uses her power to lead people astray. And so it's not actually the best metaphor for a woman who's a slave, who's stereotyped as oversexed. Now, we can talk about how Christians have traditionally interpreted the notion of Jezebel and what kind of woman constitutes a Jezebel. But what about popular culture? Is it possible that popular culture uses the term Jezebel in some racist way simply to mean a sort of stereotypically oversexed view of black women? Not as far as I can tell. Not until Dr. White sort of connected the idea of Jezebel to black women specifically. In popular culture, there was a movie back in the 30s starring Bette Davis in which she played a Southern belle who was defiant and defied social convention and defied the men in her life and so on. And that movie was entitled Jezebel. Well, Jezebel was the white woman. It wasn't a black character in that particular movie. And there have been songs and other movie portrayals. Now, more recently, in 2019, there was apparently a movie named Jezebel that is about a black woman who gets involved in pornography. So we do see a connection in popular culture very recently. But is that the way that the term has been used for a long time as exclusively a term for loose, oversexed black women? Not as far as I can see. Now, perhaps if I did more research, I'd find that there is some definite connection between Jezebel and this clear stereotype of black women as over-sexualized. But as far as I can see, the term Jezebel was first applied to this clearly racist stereotype by a scholar back in the 70s. And it's not a widely used term by white supremacists or clear racists. It's a term that this scholar used to describe a stereotype. And I don't think that pastors should be bound by the fact that some scholar somewhere used a biblical story to represent a stereotype. They could just as easily have used the term the harlot stereotype or the loose woman stereotype or the nymphomaniac stereotype. This scholar chose to use the term Jezebel. But a pastor like Pastor Buck certainly ought to be able to look at a biblical story and draw a parallel between that and a real life situation. And that pastor shouldn't be charged with racism if he's not perpetuating a stereotype. In Pastor Buck's case, he wasn't talking about Kamala Harris's personal sexual behavior at all. He was talking about her policies. For me, I'm not necessarily trying to defend Pastor Buck or condemn Pastor Buck or condemn the people that are condemning Pastor Buck. My concern is that we look at this biblical passage and we understand how it's being used and whether we can draw parallels to other people. Is it automatically racist to compare a black woman with Jezebel? Well, it depends on what kind of comparison you're making. If you're saying that Kamala Harris is an oversexed black woman, like all black women are oversexed, then that's racist. Of course it is. But if you're saying, well, she's like Jezebel in this specific respect, and here I'm showing the parallels between these two women, that's not necessarily racist. That's simply applying the Bible to life and saying, look, I see a parallel here. Let's draw a lesson from that. I want to thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it and found it helpful, please click like and subscribe to my channel for future videos. Thanks, and have a great day.